Welcome to History 339, the History of China. This is Module 1, Micro Lecture 3, Geography and Culture. First, we want to describe a little bit about what the continent of Asia is. Really, the continents of Europe and Asia are one single continent, which we refer to oftentimes as Eurasia. However, there has been just a kind of geographical dividing point that generally is given between Europe and Asia. And those two kind of boundaries are given as number one, the Ural Mountains and the Ural River of Russia. So everything on the west of that is the European side of Russia, and on the east, the Asian part of Russia. And then down here in this area of Greece on one side and Turkey of the other, you have the Dardanelles Straits, the Sea of Marmara, and the Bosphorus Straits. And so on this side is Europe, and on this side is Turkey, which is actually part of Asia. So it's just, again, a very arbitrary geographical dividing point, just to let you know China then is in Asia because it is east of the Ural Mountains and it's east of all of this stuff along the Black Sea. So again, this would be basically your dividing point for Asia here. China, again, is over here to the south of Mongolia, and it is to the northeast of India. You can see its relationship to North and South Korea and Japan, and also to Southeast Asia. Now, I need to tell you just a little bit about climate as it applies to the monsoons in China so that you can understand the history of China much better. And I'm going to give you two little weather commandments. I have many more weather commandments when I've taught in the past geography. But Dr. Tenkati's weather commandments. Number one, land areas heat up and cool down more rapidly than water. Conversely, water heats up and cools down more slowly than land. Thus, water has a tempering effect on climate. Now, how you can remember that, if you choose to remember that, is where do you go in the summer to cool down? You go to water. You go to the ocean, or to a large lake, or to a river, or even to a swimming pool. Now, on the other hand, hot air rises and experiences a drop in atmospheric pressure. Cold air falls and experiences a rise in atmospheric pressure. So, again, an example of this is a beautiful hot air balloon. They don't call them cold air balloons for no reason at all. Now, to understand China, you need to understand the monsoon. A monsoon is not this kind of torrential 24-hour-a-day rain for weeks on end. That is not a monsoon at all. That is just kind of the film version of monsoons. A monsoon, rather, it consists, a monsoon climate, of a distinct wet and dry seasons. And it all has to do with the fact that the continent Asia is the largest continent. It's so huge, and the surrounding oceans and the differing air pressures over, as we just told you, water versus land. So East and South China experience a summer monsoon, as evidenced here in this diagram to the right. So during the summer, the Asian landmass heats up faster than the surrounding Pacific Ocean. And when the air heats up, it forms a low-pressure zone over Central Asia. And so high pressure here, see the H's, low pressure here. Winds go from high pressure to low pressure, so moisture-laden winds sweep in from the Pacific and Indian Oceans, bringing rains to China. South China experiences an East Asian winter monsoon, depicted here on the left, when the Asian landmass cools down faster than the surrounding Pacific Ocean, forming a high-pressure zone, as you see in the H here, over Central Asia. Winds go from high pressure to low pressure. So winds sweep from Central Asia towards the Pacific and Indian Oceans, along the way picking up rain and moisture and producing rains in some areas. Now, the monsoons are very important because, of course, you need a lot of rain as you get in South China for the production of rice, which grows in water in rice paddies. Now I ask here a very simple question. What in the world are steppes? Steppes are areas of little rainfall and of a very little vegetation other than some short grasses, not many trees, for instance. An example of a steppe years ago would have been out in the American West, where things are very dry for the most part and don't receive a lot of rainfall. Today, we know that part of the American West as the Great Plains. And they're actually a very productive area of the world because in the 1800s and the 1900s, humankind developed special hybrid forms of wheat and other seeds that could be cultivated and harvested in a drier climate with less rain. Also, there are other things like railroads could bring into steppe regions like the Great Plains of the United States all the supplies they needed, including wood and so on and so forth. So today we know a lot of these steppe regions as actually being kind of breadbaskets of the world. But in the time period up through really the late 19th century, that is the late 1800s, these areas of steppes, which were seen all throughout the world, were generally not regarded as very inhabitable. In fact, usually little farming went on in those areas, but rather you would have nomadic herdsmen who would take their herds of sheep and goats and horses and so forth, and in the summertime they would go north where their herds would eat the grasses, and in the wintertime they would move south. And so these pastoral nomads inhabited a large range of what you see here in pink as steppes. And these stretched all the way from Europe, all the way into China. Out of these steppes would come the so-called foreign barbarians who would sometimes attack settled civilizations like China. Out of the steppes would come, for instance, the Mongols. So those Eurasian steppes stretch from the Danube River in Europe across the plain of Hungary through Russia, north of the Black Caspian and Aral Seas, east of the Pamirs, plateaus, and mountains. And so that is one thing to remember, because China was always, building walls, the Great Wall, against the foreigners of the steppes and trying to keep out people who occasionally, like the Mongols, would invade and conquer China. Now, there are some very important divisions in China, and really one of those divisions occurs right around the Qin Mountains, the Dabarat Mountains, and it leads right through, right here you see the Wanghe River, or the Yellow River as we know it, and it flows into the Yellow Sea. All of this is North China. And North China is a very prosperous area, a very populated area, and one where you can cultivate things like millet and grain and so forth. The Yellow River very often floods. It would be necessary for the dynasties of China to build levees along the Yellow River to protect the peasants and the farmers from flooding. Now, South China, and you see here a wheat-rice line. So North China, known for wheat and millet and grains and the production of those. And then South China, here down here, is known more for the production of rice. And here the Yangtze River flows and into the East China Sea. So the two great rivers, the Wanghe, the Yellow River, and the Yangtze River as well, North and South China. Now, a little bit about the beginnings of Chinese civilization, which really traces its roots to the Yellow River Valley. The Chinese have the oldest continuous civilization in the world, going back some 4,000 years, and also the oldest centralized state, which has survived with interruptions since 221 BC. Now, one thing you need to know a little bit about is the way that we transcribe Chinese writing into English. It's been done historically by two major methods. One was called the Wade-Giles method, and it produced things that sort of look like this. And again, I'm not going to completely spend a lot of time for this. But Mao Zedong, the great leader Mao Zedong, and the old Wade-Giles systems look like this. The newer and more preferred system that the Chinese government itself promotes is called Pinyin, and that is what this PowerPoint utilizes. That is what I'm going to utilize in this class. That is what your two textbooks, Gelber and Starr, Gelber's Dragon and the Foreign Devils, and Starr's Understanding China, both use. You're going to notice the older system of Wade-Giles being used in the Story of China with Michael Wood, which a little bit, I find a little bit strange, considering that PBS, originally a BBC documentary, was, dates from only 2017. It's very new. Don't know the reason for that, but you should not become too concerned. So the difference would be if we take and look at a place like the city of Guangzhou. It would be in the new Pinyin, Guangzhou versus Guangzhou. I mean, they're pronounced the same, it's just the way they're spelled. Or if you would look like at Peking, Beijing, Mao Zedong, and the city of Tianjin. Okay. Now, another thing too that the Story of China and Michael Wood and your books are going to underscore is the Chinese believe that there was a certain dynastic cycle, that history moved in cycles, and one of these was had to do with the dynasties that ruled China. And typically an explanation of the dynastic cycle would be an emperor would come to the throne, and, of course, his sons would succeed him as emperor, and they would set up a dynasty, right? And we're going to have different names for those dynasties. And for the first 2, 3, 4 emperors or so, the emperors tended to be hard-working, and they attempted to build up the empire of China and to do everything that they were supposed to do. And in fact, they were seen as kind of the mediator between the heavens and the earth. And literally, the emperor was called the Son of Heaven, the Son of Heaven. And an emperor was considered holding, the mandate of heaven, that right to rule, as long as he ruled in a righteous manner, treated his subjects well, tried to achieve prosperity, did everything imaginable, had a suitable army that could protect China, perhaps, walls or a great wall that could protect China, building maybe a canal like the Grand Canal to assist in moving things from place to place, keeping the levees along the Yellow River maintained, etc., so that floods, wouldn't ravage the countryside. And if he did all of those things that were expected and carried out the rites and celebrations, religious rites and celebrations, then the mandate of heaven stayed with the emperor. And if somehow he began not to do what he was supposed to do, to kind of disregard his governmental duties, to get a little lazy, to become perhaps a little too interested in sort of wine, women, and song, and not in his governance. If he became corrupt, if he treated people poorly or abused people, then that things would happen, and heaven would let people know that things were not right. There would be floods along the Yellow River, or earthquakes, or whatever occurred. And having not prepared for those, then it would be the right of everyone, including peasants, to rebel against an emperor who had lost the mandate of heaven. So this dynastic cycle is literally emperors and dynasties coming to the fore and then slowly declining and being replaced, sometimes in rebellions, sometimes by invasions from other people, by other dynasties. The earliest oracle bones that have been found by archaeologists, and oracle bones, typically they would take the shoulder blades of oxen or whatever and put them in a fire, and then, you know, the emperor's special diviners, you know, fortune tellers would read the cracks that would occur in the scapula or the shoulder bones of those animals, and they would predict the future. So there was a lot of belief in ancient China in oracle bones and in divination, kind of predicting the future. And many times on those early, very early oracle bones, dating from really the earliest of the dynasties, the Zhou dynasties, there were these pictograms or picture words. And so you actually would see things like the sun, the moon, and they would tell what the problem was that they were trying to divine, they were trying to figure out, and then on the other side they would write what the answer was. Well, as time went on, these pictograms began to be used on paper and with ink, and when you put words like this that are pictograms that literally look like a picture, I mean, that looks like the sun, that looks like the moon, etc. This looks like the sun coming up behind a tree, maybe in the morning, hence the east. This could look like a sacrifice, etc. These actually become easier to do when you use a brush and you use brush strokes and ink. They become easier to do when they're flattened. And so see how this would have been flattened, excuse me, to this eventually. And this flattened to something like this, and this to this. And this is how the Chinese written language literally was formed across the course of the centuries as the language developed. And of course, the sounds for these words are the things that are transliterated into either the Wade-Giles or the Pinyin system. Well, now we need to talk just very shortly about a situation in terms of the religion and culture of China. And China is going to be actually very influenced from a philosophy, a religion that actually came out of India and was founded by Siddhartha Gautama, who was known as the Buddha. And the Buddha, one day, he was very wealthy. He was a wealthy prince. And one day he was sitting under a Bodhi tree, and he was enlightened. And it was at this point that he realized that the answer to everything, or most everything in life, would be the middle way. So, again, not being absolutely on one end of any particular spectrum, but looking at the middle as the way to understanding and enlightenment. And then he went ahead and formulated a number of paths and truths. They were called the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. You don't necessarily need to know all of those. I'm just telling you the overall outlines of this. Well, across the years, and Buddhism was believed in a reincarnation of souls, that all of us took part in this greater soul of the universe, and that we could build up across the years good karma or bad karma. And if we had bad karma, then what would happen is when we would die, we would be reborn and we would have to make up for that bad karma, and we would need to do good karma. So the idea that everybody is related, everything that everybody does has an effect, positive or negative, on the world, on the universe, on everyone else, is a central belief of Buddhism. Well, actually, that kind of thought that, maybe you would need to undergo many different reincarnations was not necessarily a positive thing to think about. You might say to yourself, gee, I'd like to come back again and have another shot at it, but you might not want to have, hundreds of different reincarnations. Well, two major types of Buddhism developed. And the whole purpose of Buddhism was that you could eventually achieve nirvana. That is, that when you died, you would become one with the whole of the universe. And describing nirvana is sort of like describing what happens to a candle when you blow it out. You blow out a candle, and that's all you see is smoke, and the smoke becomes one with the air and everything around it. So Theravada Buddhism developed, and it was a belief that to achieve nirvana, you had to leave this secular world behind with all its concerns and problems and brokenness and enter a monastery. Well, that was not practical for most people who had to earn a living as farmers and craftsmen. So Mahayana Buddhism was the belief that you could live in this world and still achieve nirvana if you lived a good moral life. And it's this Buddhism that introduced the concept of the bodhisattva, a deceased human being who could achieve nirvana if he chose to do so. He or she chose to do so, but out of compassion has volunteered to help others attain nirvana. So bodhisattvas were like Buddhist saints. Buddhism was ultimately introduced into China from India, where it existed side by side with Confucianism. The two were not seen as being exclusive. You could be both a Buddhist and a Confucianist, which is something totally different than our Western world sees. Our Western world would have problems saying that you could be both a Christian and a Jew, or that you could be both a Jew and a Muslim, or you could be both Catholic and Jewish. It would see a kind of a problem. But in China, where things were very much focused on the group, Buddhism and Confucianism were a way for people in groups to live in harmony and to live moral lives. Let's look a little bit at an ethical philosophy. It wasn't really a religion as much as an ethical philosophy. And it was developed by Confucius, who lived in China from 551 to 479 BC. He had a modest home life. His father died when he was only 3, and Confucius tried desperately to become a government official, but he only held insignificant posts. He earned his living by being a teacher. He was compassionate by nature and even accepted poor students who could not afford to pay him tuition. Confucius lived during a period of great civil unrest in China. Many soldiers were paid to be mercenaries and to deliver the severed heads of their enemies. Whole populations were being captured. We read of very mass slaughters. There are even accounts of the conquered being thrown into boiling cauldrons and their relatives forced to drink the human soup. Confucius saw the need for China and the Chinese people to internalize a value structure. He was interested in proper decorum, politeness, diplomacy, and a respect for others. And so he developed the so-called 5 Confucian relationships between a father and a son, a ruler and a subject, an elder brother and a younger brother, a husband and a wife, an elder friend and a junior friend. In all of these relationships, we see the Chinese respect for age. But in each and every one of these relationships, please know that they were reciprocal relationships. They were two-way streets. That is, for instance, number 1, a son owed obedience and respect to his father, but a father was expected to provide examples and a model and education in some kind of craft for his son and to treat him properly. So each one of these were reciprocal relations. During the Han Dynasty from 206 BC to 220 CE, Confucianism became, in effect, China's sort of state religion. It was the basic discipline for the training of government officials, and that was a pattern which continued for the most part until the establishment of the Republic in 1912. Another legacy of Confucianism was the importance of saving face, of acute kind of social sensitivity, of not being an embarrassment to your collective kind of group. And another emphasis was on memorization, and this came from memorizing the works of Confucius, including the Analects. Now, when we look at all of this, we're going to see that sometimes, things would be changed a little bit over the period of time, as people would add things to Confucianism and etc. and do other things. But what we do need to look at is, while Confucius believed that leaders should be virtuous, and Mencius believed that people are born good, so they believed in virtue of people, other people believed that humans were essentially selfish, including Sun Tzu. These people tended to fall in a different category, which would be on the other spectrum, the other end of the spectrum, and that would be legalism. That a ruler and his laws are number 1 and should never be questioned. And an example of a legalist was Shang Yang, a chief minister of the state of Qin. He himself was a legalist, and he not only made up many of the laws and believed you should follow them, but he believed in the sword and he died by the sword. Ironically enough, he was executed by being drawn and quartered. No mercy there. The last thing we want to look at is Taoism. Tradition states that Taoism was founded by Lao Tzu, who was born about 604 BC. Although some people claim that he was born 3 centuries later, others doubt if he ever really lived. He supposedly wrote the Tao Te Ching, the way and its power, and then after he wrote it, he allegedly rode off on a water buffalo toward Tibet and was never seen again. The Tao is the way of the universe, the norm, the rhythm, the driving force of all nature, the ordering principle behind all life. And the Taoists often use the analogy of water. Water is like the Tao, they said, because it flows, it's flexible, it's adaptable. And although it can be patient and gentle and beautiful, water can be powerful. It can be a source of life, and it can be a source of death. A separate school called Yin Yang was later adopted by both Confucianism and Taoism. And Yin and Yang are two complementary principles. Yang represents masculinity, warmth, light, activity, hardness, and dryness. Yin represents femininity, coolness, darkness, passivity, softness, and dampness. Interaction between yin and yang, between the male and the female, produces the phenomenon of nature. And so you have, as you see here, this yin and yang, and notice that you cannot draw a line through, a diameter through this circle without getting anywhere a little bit of the yin and a little bit of the yang. And so it is with humans and society as well. You're going to be seeing in the first few parts of the story of China a little bit about the Han Dynasty and other dynasties. This again is another great map. It shows you some of the steppe regions, the desert regions to the north, what we associate with the Mongols, Mongolia. Shows you where the Great Wall was. It shows you the extent of China's first really important and impressive empire, the Han Empire, which was, it existed at the same time as the Roman Empire in Europe. So any questions, please feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help, and have a great week.